Aw, man. Now who's going to monitor Taylor Swift's fertility and tell her to submit to her husband? Guess we'll only have Johnny Law to step into those very important shoes now. Anyway, yes, this is a bit of a special episode here because on September 10th, 2025, yesterday, as of this recording, Charlie Kirk, the co founder of Turning Point USA and a polarizing right wing activist, was fatally wounded during an outdoor speech at Utah Valley University, and he was 31 years old. And by fatally wounded, I mean he is now deceased. I'll get more into the assassination as a topic later on, but first I want to talk about the legacy of Charlie Kirk. Who was Charlie Kirk? So, I'm not going to lie, I have not shed a single tear over what happened. In fact, the man himself seemed to view gun deaths as just another cost of living in a free society. And if you don't believe me, if you think I'm being too insensitive about that, in an April 2023 Turning Point USA event in Salt Lake City, Utah, Kirk said, I think it's worth to have a cost of, unfortunately, some gun deaths every single year so that we can have the Second Amendment to protect our God given rights. And you'll notice that's a pattern with these people. They'll say that things are God given, and they'll use religion as sort of a crutch rhetorically. And I'm sure some of them truly believe in that stuff, but it's something that's very predictable, and it all ties in together in this weird overarching ideology, and that's what Charlie Kirk was a huge part of. So Charlie Kirk also lied about George Floyd, of course, like so many of them did. He seemed fine with the police killing George Floyd by kneeling on his neck. Kirk said birth control makes women angry, which is weird because, I mean, what makes men angry then? Does birth control, does that explain angry men? It's just like weird arguments, like what exactly what makes women so uniquely angry and women's anger such a unique problem, and that you have to try to tie it in with birth control. I don't think there was a lot of science supporting his argument there. He also promoted false and disproven claims of fraud in the 2020 election, of course, like so many of them did. And it doesn't end there. The legacy continues to get weirder and more dark. So he opposed Martin Luther King, at least at various points. He was trash talking MLK, and he said the Civil Rights Act of 1964 wasn't good. Of course, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits unequal application of voter registration requirements. It prohibits racial segregation in schools and public accommodations, and prohibited, and still to some degree prohibits employment discrimination, although the current far right Supreme Court is working on scrapping all of that stuff, I'm sure. And Kirk posted on Instagram in March 2024 that the Great Replacement is not a theory, it's a reality. And also once said, and I'm quoting him now, this isn't me saying this is something he actually said, Jewish communities have been pushing the exact kind of hatred against whites that they claim to want people to stop using against them. So, very anti-Semitic. Yet, how come the Trump White House isn't going after him for saying that thing that is plainly an anti-Semitic trope, right? I mean, that is part of the Great Replacement theory. In a lot of cases, they theorize that these Jewish people are turning minorities against white people. That is kind of what the Great Replacement theory is. Charlie Kirk echoed that view. So did Tucker Carlson. But the the real anti-Semites, we're told, are these people who are protesting what Netanyahu has been inflicting on the population of Gaza. You know, it's not the KKK, it's not neo-Nazi organizations, it's just random student protesters. That's like the source of all of the anti-Semitism in this country, according to them. It's not David Duke, not not Charlie Kirk. You know, but anyway, Charlie Kirk was in favor of the mass slaughter and starvation of Palestinians because the death of one is a tragedy and the death of millions is just a statistic in the classic formulation. So this episode is going to be a little different. Normally I have like three different sections. Today I'm just going to kind of lump it all together, and we're going to focus overwhelmingly on Mr. Kirk here and his major controversies and scandals. And I'll get a little bit into the death of Charlie Kirk as well. But some of the most serious and well documented controversies tied to Kirk and his organization Turning Point USA, or TPUSA, which makes it sound like it's an organization either in favor of toilet paper or throwing toilet paper across the United States like a Halloween prank or something. If it was just about, like providing people with toilet paper across the United States, that would actually be a better organization. And, I would be way more likely to support that because toilet paper is a valid thing. It's a thing that a lot of people really need. They might be short on that supply, and if TPUSA actually just did that, hey, that actually be kind of kick ass. But that's not really what they're about. So Charlie Kirk was involved in disinformation and election fraud claims. TPUSA and Kirk were criticized for promoting false or misleading claims about the 2020 U.S. election results. In other words, they also spread misleading information about COVID 19, including vaccines and mandates, and presumably some other aspects of it. There was a whole lot of disinformation going around at that time. There are, times where they were stoking racial animus and culture war rhetoric, of course. Kirk was accused of using racial grievance and fear to mobilize young conservatives, and, well, he was accused of it because that's what he was doing, particularly around issues like critical race theory. And hey, that's what my podcast kind of gets its name off of, critical weight theory, only they, you know, are fear mongering about critical race theory. And, they have a lot of fear mongering about race in education, etc. Because you don't want those non-white people to have access to education, I guess. That's supposed to be spooky and scary. Well, what's funny is that I'm using the word spooky, and some people, like on the ultra PC left, they are overly sensitive about that word because that has a racial connotation. So they're like, oh, you can't use the word spooky around Halloween anymore, because some people used it as a racist term in human history or whatever. So, you know, you get a little bit of political correctness from the left as well as from the right. And Charlie Kirk promoted political correctness on the far right. He framed many things as threats to white identity or Western civilization, and those are often code words for white supremacy. Like their way of promoting the basic Nazi-like idea of having white people at the top and possibly reducing the numbers of non-white people. When Elon Musk talks about how Western civilization is in danger, that's really what Elon Musk means. And of course, Charlie Kirk has been supportive of Elon Musk, or he had been. I guess I should say it in the past tense now. Anyway, as an example, of Charlie Kirk trash talking Martin Luther King Jr., he actually just said that MLK was awful. So, I mean, that's a very nuanced take. It's not like there's a whole lot of, you know, wiggle room and something like that. Just saying he was awful, and am I supposed to shed a tear over Charlie Kirk when he says things like that about MLK? No, fuck that. I'm not. I'm not doing that. And he, drew fire for being derisive and in some ways conspiratorial because that's one of the things that he's done over the years. And he had TPUSA had a professor watch list. Professor, I almost said. I was going to say professional at first because that's what I read there, but professor watch list, and he was guilty of intimidating academics, of course. And the TPUSA's professor watch list named faculty members who allegedly discriminated against conservative students or promoted leftist ideology. And of course, by this point in this country's history, leftist ideology might just mean that, you know, people should have due process rights and that sort of thing. Like they should have evidence provided if they're accused of a crime, and there should be access to courts and lawyers and things like that. That is right now what leftist ideology actually entails, just having things that we used to take for granted because they've pretty skillfully moved the conversation to the point where right now, if you just want people to have their day in court, well, now that means you're on the far left. And of course, Charlie Kirk intimidated academics and students, undermined academic freedom, and invited harassment of faculty. And the organization also had some internal issues, from what I understand. There were reports of dissatisfaction among young conservatives within TPUSA. Some felt certain views were off limits, or that Kirk had a top down celebrity style that did not allow genuine internal dissent. And what do you know? That's something you might expect within a fascistic organization. So, no huge surprise with that one. There were also controversies over how TPUSA was funded. There were large donors and, of course, political influence. Its relationship with Christian nationalism, which of course has nothing to do with the actual teachings of Jesus. You know, the Jesus of the Bible was, at least in a lot of ways, not a far right figure. He actually urged people to be accepting of immigrants, to accept immigrants the way you would accept your neighbor. And, he was explicitly or implicitly um, fascistic, when it comes to that sort of thing. The idea was that Christians should dominate the nation in all ways, and if you're not a Christian, well, maybe you don't have rights, maybe you don't have access to resources and decision making, and you could be a second class citizen at best. And that's how religion has largely entered into the political organization of TPUSA. It's a far right ideal of Christians owning American institutions and determining how life happens in the society. Of course, there's been some physical harassment and confrontation. For example, two TPUSA members, including a cameraman, accosted an Arizona State University professor named David Boyles about his sexuality and classes, and the confrontation left the professor injured. And there have been false and misleading statements flagged on social media. At times, Kirk's statements were flagged or removed for spreading misleading information about voting. And it's hard to say what the biggest scandal is from Charlie Kirk. If one had to pick, the controversy around disinformation and election fraud claims, combined with culture war rhetoric and profiteering off fear, seem like the most consequential scandals because it's threatened democratic institutions, trust, and has led to real harm. The professor watch list was also major in terms of its implications for academic freedom and civil liberties. The idea is that you're not allowed to talk about these things if TPUSA has its way. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure there are, you know, stereotypical leftists who would create lists like that as well. But in most of those cases, that would be like to address people who are just fascists and stuff like that. Who would want to have discrimination on a college campus and things like that, because that's really actually what makes somebody a leftist to a large degree, at least in modern times. So broadly, the disinformation and concentration of power and funding and efforts to suppress dissent seem to amount to his biggest scandals. And assessing from an actual freedom lover's perspective, it's an interesting thing to look at an organization and a figure like this, because from a freedom loving lens, which critiques power, hierarchy, coercion, capitalism, and state authority, the controversies are actually pretty clear, basically clear as day. So, what freedom lovers care about are often at odds with what Kirk and the TPUSA goons would advocate for. So, the power and hierarchy thing are really key here. Freedom lovers reject unaccountable hierarchies in institutions, politics, and social life. Kirk, on the other hand, amassed significant influence over young people, donors, and campuses. And of course, he advocates for things like man being the master over his wife and stuff like that. And of course, banning things like gay marriage and, basically having the government micromanage who you can be in a relationship with when it comes to being consenting adults. Like, you know, keep in mind, like I just said earlier, this is somebody who was critical of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So, how do you think that translates over to personal relationships? And TPUSA created structures like I said, the watch list, the donor networks, and the internal discipline that amplified his authority. Critics claimed dissent was limited inside the organization, and this concentration of power contradicted freedom loving ethics, which opposed centralized ideological control. And, of course, there's a lot of ideology and coercion going on here. And freedom lovers view coercion not only as a physical, but also social, psychological, and economic phenomenon, imposing belief or behavior through fear, social pressure, or manipulation. So Kirk and TPUSA used fear laden rhetoric like threats to Western values and all that stuff, which could coerce people socially, and the watch list threatened faculty reputations or even safety and discouraged certain speech, while of course claiming to be free speech warriors. Also, framing dissent as betrayal or moral failure punished people socially. And then, of course, these types of people don't want you to be too critical of the state and capitalism. Freedom lovers can be deeply critical of the state and of capitalist institutions, how they foster inequality, exploit people, restrict autonomy, all of that sort of stuff. But TPUSA was embedded in political and economic networks They had big donors, nonprofit and political funding, influence in electoral politics, and all that kind of stuff. They were obvious insiders, just like Donald Trump was an obvious insider. And that's been true since like the 1980s at least. Well, he was an insider before then too, but especially during the 80s is when Trump had dinner with President Reagan. So I mean, and that was also with somebody in these got the I think it was the king of Saudi Arabia. So he was having dinner with the president of the United States and a a theocratic king, a leader. And of course, you got misinformation and disinformation and ideology as part of TPUSA. Those serve to preserve existing power structures, political and economic, which people who actually value freedom might openly question. They might see these power structures as being oppressive in some way. Then you had partnerships within Christian nationalism that reinforce state and so called moral authority. And of course, the goofy rhetoric of free markets as freedom often mask inequalities in who actually has choices in the system. So, as I often note, the so called free market isn't just people freely making decisions, because the free market is actually a global legal system, meaning that it's truly around the globe at this point, and practically every single decision made within that framework is done under some sort of legal duress, coercion, in other words. So it's not just the invisible hand gently guiding people along. No, there's a lot of legal protections of things like private property and intellectual property and all that kind of stuff that prevent people from actually engaging in a free market without there being coercion involved. So, an obvious example would be if somebody was to steal a candy bar from a store and the police go after them. Well, that's not the business just naturally taking a loss. You know, uh, that's not truly the free market to have the police chase after somebody and put them in jail and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, you could say it's a relatively free market compared to other scenarios. You could say there's relative freedom allowed in it, but it's certainly not a purely free market. So, all this rhetoric of like, a purely free economy and people just freely making choices and, you know, you can choose all these different things. Well, you can't because money is an issue. You're tying freedom to money, the amount of money in your wallet. So that is not, actual freedom. It's like a restriction on human freedom. It's a culturally enforced, uh, in many ways close to being universalized restriction on freedom. So yeah, that's something that you probably would not hear Charlie Kirk get into. Well, you definitely won't hear him get into that now. But I mean the Charlie Kirk types. Um, anyway, moving on. What about free speech and intellectual freedom? Well, freedom lovers usually value open communications, autonomy of thought, and free association. The watch list and suppression of certain views on race, gender, and sexuality, or the outgrouping of dissenters, undermined academic freedom just as it tries to undermine real freedom. So, as I've also said before, like when it comes to transgender people, gender affirming care for youths, like a lot of people they view that as saying like um I care about the safety of the child or whatever. And sure enough, I understand that. But here's the thing: in a free society, if if a child, their parents, and their doctors all want to like graft deer antlers onto a child's head, then that is their freedom to do so. It's kind of none of my business. I'm using deer antlers as sort of a comical example here, for the sake of drama as well, to like sh- give an extreme example, I suppose. But if all those different people want to do that, the child, the parents, the doctors, let's even throw teachers in there. Well, then why what's even the scandal here? That's what people are allowed to do in a free society. You're free to alter your physical body. You're also free to say things that people disagree with. And if it's a medical decision, then that is also their freedom. You know, and in the Turning Point USA, internal cultural pressures inside that organization reportedly discouraged dissent, and that ran counter to values of decentralized dialogue, which are pretty fundamental to freedom. You need to be able to talk without having things being just sanctioned from above. That's kind of actually what freedom entails. And for the potential harm, freedom lovers care about real consequences. That's physical harm, psychological harm, suppression, exclusion, erosion of trust, etc. The disinformation that, you know, TPS TPUSA, I keep mangling that. But anyway, their disinformation eroded trust in democratic institutions. The harassment of professors and marginalized groups had real material effects. The polarization fueled social and political conflict. Ideological manipulation could and did harm people's sense of trust, freedom, and safety. And of course, before Charlie Kirk was assassinated, you had uh, politicians in Minnesota who were killed in their homes. So all of this type of targeting of political dissent and the polarization, the harsh rhetoric, not just the rhetoric, but the harsh policies, and the fear mongering has led to uh, furtherance of political violence, and it's starting to become more reciprocal. And so, from a freedom lover's viewpoint, after Kirk's death, what stood out most was not a single event, but the structural dynamics that his life and work left behind. I could get into that some more, but I feel like I've said enough about it. Well, I mean, I'll just say that there were identity grievances. He was basing much of his political strategy on not on building commonality, but highlighting threats, fear of loss, identity grievances, things that tend to divide people, suppress nuance, and discourage open dialogue. And he centralized ideological authority as part of the MAGA movement. Like the Republican Party just became about Donald Trump and very little else. You had the views on race, gender, and sexuality, and he didn't want criticism of conservatism, and people would be penalized socially, reputationally, and sometimes more if he has his way. And of course, it undermines free association, which is a core value of freedom. So he's also just he was also just somebody who profiteered from polarization, conflict, fear, and culture war appear to have been monetized and politicized. That is especially troubling to people who see profit motives as commonly intertwined with oppression. So basically, he's, benefiting off of the oppression of others. He's making profit, or he was making profit off. I keep referring him to him in the present text, but he was benefiting off of oppression by, literally drawing money from sowing conflict and fear of, wicked immigrants and people like that, and LGBTQ people, and all of these different culture war talking points. So his biggest scandal in hindsight was the lasting legacy of that system, how it shaped political discourse, marginalized dissenting voices, amplified hierarchy, and contributed to a climate where disinformation and fear had real influence over public institutions, and the population is suffering as a result. And the event where he was slain was part of Turning Point USA's American Comeback Tour that drew about 3,000 people. And Kirk was speaking under a tent emblazoned with Prove Me Wrong, a debate format table meant to let attendees challenge his views on politics and culture. So that part of it, that sounds like it's healthy. But I mean, let's face it, the whole point of that is for him to, or for people like him, to engage with critics who aren't as, you know, who aren't typically as involved in political thought and political debate. So, you can find some people who might say something stupid, like the mistakes that I make in this episode, for example, um, when I mess things up with a person's name or something like that. That might stand out more than somebody who's like a real professional debater. Not to say nobody like that ever showed up at one of these events, because I actually know that's some people did. But overall, what they want to do is like just find the worst example of someone who shows up to an event like this, and then they'll like point fingers and laugh at that person because they represent the opposing view. That's like the main thing about this type of event. But shortly after noon, around 12:10 or 12:20 p.m., somewhere around there, a lone gunshot rang out, striking Kirk in the neck. Witnesses describe blood flowing from the left side of his neck. Panic swept the crowd, and many people ducked for cover or fled. And because it was just one shot, that makes it seem more like it was a professional job, like it wasn't just some random person, but somebody who actually knew what they were doing. Well, I mean, I could still technically be a random person, but at the end of the day, it sounds like it was more of a professional type of shooter. And law enforcement believe the shot came from a rooftop, specifically the roof of the Losey Center, I think it's pronounced, or is it Losi? But it was, approximately 140 to 200 yards from where the Prove Me Wrong event was held in the courtyard. A person dressed in dark clothing was seen running across the roof shortly after the shot. Earlier, a shape or motionless figure had been seen there just before the event. Authorities they recovered what they describe as a high-powered bolt-action rifle in a nearby wooded area. Investigators are also collecting physical evidence, including palm prints, footprints, or other traces. So maybe by the time I've recorded this, somebody will have, you know, arrested somebody. It could be that this is all outdated, or not all of it, but some of it is outdated information. Maybe they've caught the suspect and it's the actual person, and there's like a full confession and slam dunk evidence. I don't know what's happening as I record this, but for now it's actually unsolved and the shooter is still at large. Law enforcement say they have good video footage of the suspect, though no identity has been confirmed, at least again as of this recording. Initial arrests were made, but the people held were released after questioning and determined not to be connected to the shooting. And that, of course, happens in these sorts of events. In response, the FBI received over 130 tips, launched a full investigation, and made use of all available resources. Blah blah blah. People moving through stairwells. If they took a position on a roof near the stage, they're saying that they tracked these movements. And after the shot, somebody allegedly jumped off the roof and fled to a nearby neighborhood. And politicians from across the spectrum condemned the killing. Utah's governor, Spencer Cox, called it a political assassination. Trump and other conservative leaders named Kirk as a martyr, and they're citing threats to free expression. At the same time, some criticism focused on campuses' roles in enabling contrastive speech and whether security protections were sufficient. And like I said, there were politicians in Minnesota who were executed, and it seems like none of these right wingers care about those. And after Nancy Pelosi's wife was beat over the head with a hammer, Charlie Kirk himself was talking about how the person should be seen as a freedom lover and that kind of stuff. So that makes it a little bit more of a hypocritical thing. And there's more that I could say about this, but I kind of feel like I've said enough. And you know, it's unfortunate that we have political violence in society and all of that kind of stuff, but at the same time, when you have people out there who have plainly extreme views and they intentionally create racial division and basically try to create panic and are intentionally polarizing, well, you're possibly contributing to a climate like this. I don't want to say it's guaranteed in every instance. Like you might be able to have a relatively extreme disagreement about something and not have it become a source of violence or something like that. But at the end of the day, this is one of the dangers of the society that we live in. And what can I say? This is something that could lead to more of a conversation about gun control. Because really, I'm going to close on this note. So, if you look at the event security configuration, there were 6 campus police officers plus private security. And the fact that concealed carry is allowed in many places in Utah, those are relevant because of because all of those things failed here. And one might argue for a greater emphasis on community-based protection for non-hierarchical safety protocols when possible, and for reevaluating whether armed security and law enforcement are the most important response, or whether systemic change that is reducing ideological violence and addressing grievances is actually more urgent. So, I mean, you could get into this whole thing about, the surveillance state. Like, it's dangerous having all of these security cameras everywhere. It's a threat to privacy and liberty and stuff. And, that could be a part of it. But I would say just as important is education, reducing ideological based violence by having, you know, a, a more open society and discouraging, I guess, extreme polarization based on, things like race, gender, religion, all that kind of stuff. Just treat people normally, you know. And it's ironic that I'm saying that because that's actually more Christian than the worldview that Charlie Kirk presented. So anyway, that's about it. And I'm sure there will be people who will disagree with what I said here, and they're going to say, "Oh, you were too harsh on Charlie Kirk," but this was somebody who was too harsh on so many people out there in the world, and that harshness, it it can have a boomerang effect. It really can. So that's why not only people on the right, but people on the left and people on in the center, keep that in mind. What you put out there, it can have a boomerang effect. You know, I wouldn't say that karma is 100% real, but it's at least partially real. The the ideas and the division that we put out there, it it can have consequences. We might not fully endorse what happens. We might not even expect some of the things that will unfold. But at the end of the day, there's a reason people avoid politics. It's something that can be potentially deadly, and that's why I argue for things like multiculturalism in the first place. Because guess what? If you accept other cultures, other language, other religions, and you see people as just people, well, it's a little bit harder to dehumanize them, right? And target them for violence. So at the end of the day, Charlie Kirk was a human being. He was a person, and he was a flawed person. And I think that really some of those some of those flaws, they do have a way of uh, inspiring others to commit acts of violence. And sometimes people are targeted just because of how they look. Sometimes they're targeted based on a misunderstanding, something they said, maybe that was taken out of context, or any number of things. Sexual violence. There's a lot of different things. Class-based violence, that can still be a thing. So you really have to wonder what kind of system we're living under when things like multiculturalism are deemed as controversial. I said controversial weird, but you know what I mean. Like, if people were just leading a mostly live and let live lifestyle and had that mentality, well, things like this would be, I mean, they would almost be impossible to happen, right? We would just be faced with natural disasters as like our primary concern and the basic aspects of life. And if we had a system that actually allowed for, the general happiness of the population, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as they say, uh, you know, that would actually be a better thing than what we have. It's like basing life on the pursuit of profit, or the supremacy of one group over another. That's always going to be a failing idea, and it's always going to lead to some violence one way or the other. And if the human race is continuing to be so stupid that it can't figure that out, well, then it needs to learn to accept violence as a way of life.